Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Ukraine has been making headlines just about every day, and Singapore made headlines when it decided to impose sanctions on Russia. Quite a rare decision on the part of a small nation like Singapore. What was the key reason behind the decision?
The egregiousness of it all. The fact that it's such a dangerous precedent. The fact that it abrogates the norms of international law, the Charter of the United Nations, the fact that it's a big neighbor invading a smaller neighbor, the fact that it tramples over the concept of territorial integrity, of sovereignty, of independence. Even the allusion to historical mistakes and crazy decisions also rang alarm bells for us. If you look at what happened at the Security Council, except for the fact that Russia vetoed it clearly in its own self-interest, otherwise that resolution would have passed with sanctions to follow. So when we looked at the situation, added it all up, we thought this is a time that we have to take a stand, not because we're taking sides, but because these principles are existential for a tiny city-state.
What's different this time around, though? There have been wars before. This is the first time in about 40 years that Singapore decided to impose those sanctions.
Yes.
What's different? Why was it so important for Singapore to make a stand now?
Well, as I said just now, it's because it was so egregious. And it involved a permanent member of the Security Council. I'll give you an example. If you go back to 1978, the invasion of Cambodia, we took a stand, and in fact, we had to take a consistent, recurrent, annual set of resolutions in the United Nations all the way from 79 to 1989, more than a decade. I'll give you another example. 1983, the United States invasion of Grenada. We voted against the United States, and I would quote Professor Tommy Koh, who was our permanent representative to the UN then, and he said there are times when our adherence to principles is more important than friendship. This is certainly one of those times. I think if you zoom the lens out, what we are witnessing now is the end of an era. Post-Second World War, the concept of sovereign equality, the United Nations, trying to resolve disagreements peacefully, having the Security Council, economic integration, respect for boundaries, was a formula for peace and prosperity for almost 8 decades. Right? This is perhaps even a bigger moment than the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, because it puts a screeching full stop to that age. And now we are facing an uncertain bifurcation. This can escalate horribly. We are all looking at the abyss of stagflation. The big if now is what decisions and actions China takes. If you get a deepening of the bifurcation of the global economy, of supply chains, of technology, this will be a very, very different world. And if you just look at it from an economic perspective, what a global bifurcation means, 3 things. Number 1, progress will be slowed down. For the last 8 decades, let's take the science as an example. We were able to build on each other's advances, research and development, software, build a common stack. And that has seen rapid advances in technology. A bifurcated stack will not advance at the same pace. The second economic example is that if we all look for autarky, either in-source or friend source, you will have inflation because it will cost more, because it will be less efficient. The third economic impact of a real hard bifurcation is reduced interdependence and therefore a greater propensity to allow quarrels to get out of hand. So sanctions are double-edged swords. This is not something you engage in trivially, and that's another reason why we have been so careful never to do that unless in most egregious circumstances.
I'll pick up on bifurcation slightly later. People usually say your economic policy dictates your foreign policy. Would you have thought twice about imposing sanctions if that nation happens to be China, for instance? I mean, if you take a look at Russia, trade accounts for only 1% with Singapore. But if it's a country like China, trade accounts for 13%. So there is a lot more at stake. Would you think twice before making such a decision?
Well, I would say foreign policy actually begins at home. So first, what are your circumstances? What are your country's principles? Are your people united? And do you have the means, the capability, and the resolve to advance your interests? So it begins at home. The economy is certainly very important. And as I said, sanctions are a double-edged sword. And it leads to greater separation and ultimately to bifurcation if the two halves are far enough apart and viable separately. I don't want to get into hypothetical situations on China. To put things in perspective, the GDP of Russia is 1/10 that of China. And in terms of its trading relationship, certainly with respect to Southeast Asia, it's a tiny fraction of China. So I don't want to get into that kind of hypothetical question or situation. But I would also add, from my experience interacting with China, China is also very aware of all this. And I think that's why if you look at or you listen to what China has said, they have doubled down on the importance of territorial integrity and sovereignty. So no question about their position on that. I can't help detecting some discomfort, some awkwardness on their part with respect to this egregiousness of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine.
Having said that, how do you expect China to respond? There have been reports suggesting that perhaps Russia is looking to China for assistance, perhaps even for weapons.
I have no information on that, so I'm really not in a position to comment. But I am making the point that China does have important principles at stake to affirm and to live up to. I'm making the point that China has far more than even Russia in terms of its economic stake in an integrated, multilateral, rules-based world. And, but China will make its own decisions. And we will have to watch. I think the decisions over the next few days, next couple of weeks, are going to be absolutely crucial to this new world that is emerging ahead of us. And as some people have said, the most dangerous phase is when a new era is being born. The norms, the rules, the expectations are still inchoate, and that's when the risk of misunderstandings, miscalculations are enormous.
You talk about bifurcation, you talk about a new era. Are there echoes of a new Cold War? I mean, the last thing the region needs right now, Asia, Southeast Asia, the last thing the region needs right now are two blocs, one led by the US, the other by Russia and China. Is there a sense there are echoes of a new Cold War?
If you put yourself in Europe, it's clear that Cold War has already started. In fact, you have a shooting war in part of Europe already. If your question is what is it that Asia is looking for, and particularly Southeast Asia and Singapore, that's not our interest at all. What we are looking forward to is that, look, Singapore and Southeast Asia have been key beneficiaries of this system for the last 8 decades. Economic integration, free trade, flow of capital, investments, connectivity, mutual interdependence, and open and inclusive political and economic architecture. So if you ask any of my neighbors, what are you looking for? That's what we're interested in. We're interested in trade, we're interested in investments, we are interested in keeping our region open to all the superpowers. We're not looking for one or the other or to play games. And the worst possible outcome is to be an arena for proxy wars and superpower contestations. We have no intention of taking sides and being a cat's paw or being a vassal state for one or the other. So we're watching. There are obviously what happens in Europe will have impact on Asia, but I'm signaling what Asia's preoccupations are.
Given your concerns, the U.S. has come out to say, or rather there's some suggestions perhaps that the U.S. is trying to build an Indo-Pacific Nato. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see the U.S. trying to?
I would dismiss that out of hand.
Why?
Look at it from a Southeast Asian or an ASEAN perspective. ASEAN is not a military alliance. That's the first point. The second point is that we're not looking for one or the other superpower to be a godfather to Southeast Asia. Not at all. So the arrangements, the reference to NATO, the reference to Europe, the reference to the post-Second World War aftermath, that's all irrelevant to us as far as what we are keen on. ASEAN is meant to be an open, inclusive association focused on trade, economic integration, inclusive and expanding our bridges to all our partners, including the superpowers. And we're not interested in military alliances and godfathers. So no, I would dismiss that out of hand.
There's been no consensus within ASEAN. In fact, you said in Parliament that ASEAN leaders stayed up till the wee hours of the morning coming up with a statement which did not even refer to Russia, neither did it refer to its stance. Why was it so difficult for ASEAN to come to a consensus?
Well, I would look first at what we did agree on. We all agreed on the importance of territorial integrity. We all agreed on sovereignty. And we all agreed that the situation in Ukraine was one of grave concern. In our second statement, we also asked for an immediate ceasefire. For the 10 of us with such diverse perspectives, to be able to agree on these key bull points, I think was significant. I think we can quibble about whether Russia was named explicitly or not. But as far as I was concerned, the bottom line was territorial integrity, sovereignty, and getting. So
you're quite satisfied with the statement that was given by ASEAN?
I mean, frankly, I was pleasantly surprised we could even get that far. And I say this in all seriousness because, again, you have to understand the diversity in ASEAN. Similarly, the fact that only 2 ASEAN members abstained at the General Assembly. Frankly, even that exceeded my expectations. Again, this is not a criticism of ASEAN. This is my realistic assessment of the diversity within ASEAN. So the fact that we've gotten so far, to me, is very encouraging. It shows that we have consensus on what's really important, and we are able to express ourselves and take a stand.
For the outside world, there was no consensus when it comes to ASEAN on its perception to do with Russia's attack on Ukraine. There's been a lack of progress in terms of the situation in Myanmar. Does it pose a challenge to ASEAN's centrality? Will it erode ASEAN's relevance going forward, especially when it comes to geopolitical challenges?
My frank assessment is that we've actually done better than expected. And there are a couple of dimensions to your question. Let's deal with Myanmar. I think if we come back to first principles, if we agree on political independence, on territorial integrity and sovereignty, you will understand why we are so, in a sense, reserved or even constrained with respect to what's happening within Myanmar. Meaning, we have to adhere to the principle that the ultimate outcome of the situation in Myanmar has to depend on the people of Myanmar. And external interference will only make things worse. And therefore, ASEAN's approach to Myanmar has been to work on the 5-point consensus which our leaders agreed to. And we are very disappointed there has been no progress, but nevertheless we will keep pushing. And ultimately, the key elements of the 5-point consensus: stop the violence, especially against unarmed civilians. Number 2, there needs to be honest-to-goodness political dialogue between Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the NLD, on one hand, with the military on the other hand. Everything else is secondary. But we can try our best to bring the two horses to the waters. Whether they drink from the same water and they actually communicate is a very different order. But we must be patient, and we must not try to take shortcuts, which will unwittingly make things worse.
There's rising geopolitical tensions everywhere in the world.
Yes.
Do you think at some point this will lead to an arms race? We're already seeing the likes of Europe beefing up its defense spending. We're seeing Australia doing the same. Singapore spends about 3% of its GDP on defense, and I think there's been an increase of about 6% since the year before. Could we see an arms race in the region? Or the world, for that matter?
I would take a step back and say that what has been remarkable over the past few decades, I would say particularly over the last 4 decades, is what some commentators have called a peace dividend. Meaning, the prospects of a world war, the prospects of a major conflagration were actually so low. Many countries, and especially in Europe, could afford to spend less on defense. I think it was a mistake to assume that that is the norm. So what you're watching now, even if you watch the budget, say, of Germany, and I'm sure of the other European countries, is I think you're getting a reversion to the mean, which means that every country needs to make sure, as we do in Singapore, that we have invested enough to be able to defend our own interests. What Ukraine illustrates categorically, nobody is going to shed blood for you. You have to stand up and be prepared to fight and defend what is yours and your way of life, and whatever it takes. And therefore, if you accept that this is a reversion to the mean, I do see increased expenditures on defense across the board, across the world, because we are going into a more dangerous world. But the point is to understand that last 40 years have been a unique and, in fact, a wonderful period of peace and prosperity. And our concern is, please don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Yes, we do know this, our world needs reform. You have to deal with inequality domestically, you have to deal with polarization, you have to deal with the challenges of the digital revolution, we have to deal with pandemics still ongoing, and we have to deal with climate change. What do all these problems of the global commons require? It requires good sense, it requires sufficient consensus, it requires a multilateral rules-based world, it requires access to peaceful resolution of disputes. So that's the position that Singapore takes, you see. So coming back to your first question, why did we make this such an important stand and even underline it with unilateral sanctions? Is because we believe we are at an inflection point. And for what is worth, little Singapore is standing up for principles and expressing a hope for the rules of the engagement for this new era.
Russia's attack on Ukraine prompted concerns that China could do the same to Taiwan. And China has come out to say that it is a completely different scenario. How are you assessing the risk of that?
I agree with China that it's a completely different set of circumstances. And I don't think we should get into that kind of speculation and trying to draw parallels from it. The more important point is this, right? That once you allow these principles to be abrogated, you make unilateral resort to violence more likely. and you create a more dangerous world. Coming back to sanctions again, I completely agree with the fact that sanctions are double-edged, and that's why it's not something we engage in lightly. But it's, for what it's worth, it's a symbol of how important this is, and you have to make, hopefully, others in future who are thinking of unilateral resort to violence think twice. But that's a global, like I said, the rules of engagement for a new era. Taiwan is a far more complicated question that, we'll need a far longer discussion on this.
I want to quickly touch on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which some say, perhaps you included, say that it's been politicized, something that can be used against China.
Singapore is a tiny city-state. Our trade is more than 3 times our GDP. So when we say we believe in free trade, it's not a debating point, it's lifeblood. When we say we actually look forward ultimately to a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, it may sound grandiose, it may sound impossible, but we actually do believe in it. What have we done so far?
But is trade being politicized?
No, but let me come to that, because you have to start with the end in mind, you see. If you know that's what we're after, what have we done so far? ASEAN succeeded in getting the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. 10 of us plus 5, unfortunately India opted out. And that, frankly, primarily because of their concern with China. The other building block is the CPTPP. And that, again, it is frankly a strategic error on the part of the United States to have walked out of a skyscraper that it was a major architect for. Frankly, every time I go to Washington, I continue to make this point that actually the best thing you could do would be to return to the TPP. But anyway, the real reason America can't do this, you're right, it's political, but it is domestic politics. Until America can get its own house in order and can assure people, its own voters, that free trade and economic integration and globalization is good for ordinary people, until it can assure its workers that the appropriate social security safety nets, education, training, investment in infrastructure, until they can get that, I understand why they can't sign on to the TPP. In the meantime, there are all these alternative architectures being proposed, a variety of Indo-Pacific isms, if you know what I mean. Insofar as they are baby steps in the right direction, and particularly where they focus on important areas like climate change, digital technologies, intellectual property, I think these are good things, and we should work on them. So my attitude is to be as facilitative as possible on these measures, but I'm realistic enough, and the people whom I speak to on the other side of the Pacific know my bottom line, which is actually, if you're serious about this, come back to the TPP. And it is no accident that now you've got China and the UK and Taiwan knocking on the doors of the TPP. So that is the real question.
Earlier you talked about how China will decide in the next few days, in the next few weeks, about what to do with Russia and the position it will adopt. What are you looking out for from China to prevent that bifurcation which you're concerned about?
Well, I think the first thing is that China has enormous influence on Russia, both politically, economically, and diplomatically. And I hope they will assert their influence in the usual, with Chinese characteristics, which means quietly, discreetly, but effectively. That's a hope. Now, whether this is wishful thinking on my part, we'll see over the next few days and weeks.
Just one final question before I let you go, Minister. How long do you think this war will last? Will it be a protracted war?
Well, here you are asking me to speculate. Right. There are probably about at least 3 scenarios. One,
What's the likely scenario?
the likely scenario is a protracted quagmire for the Russians. Clearly, what has surprised the world is the fighting spirit, the independence, and the guts and courage of the Ukrainians. You can effect a military defeat. I don't think you're going to extinguish their spirit. So the most likely scenario is some form of frozen conflict with lines of control, a rump state, but probably decades of instability, and it will be a lose-lose proposition. So most likely, but it's a sad outcome. The most dangerous outcome, which can occur in days, is an escalation leading to the deployment of weapons of mass destruction, and that will be an absolute disaster for the whole world. The best possible outcome is that cool heads prevail, and China and the US and everyone else can create facilitative dialogue and negotiations and save lives. But right now, even that seems like a remote prospect. So I'm not an optimist at this point in time.
Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, we thank you so much for your time today. Great
Thank you.
insights. Thank you, sir.
Take care.